Okay. Good morning, grade 11. We will now have our last topic for your midterms. It's quite expected to only have two topics for midterms, especially that something happened last week. Regardless, we'll just have to maximize what's found in the module to make sure that you have some good content for the major exams scheduled next week. Please get your modules of Freedom of the Human Person. That's lesson 5. Before we go into this, a quick segue. How are your preparations for research? I've examined some research questions. Hopefully, you've finalized some things there, like who are the target people to be involved in your study, when you intend to conduct it. If your research questions have already, I'll try to examine your research questions again. If they've already been approved, if there are no more questions and errors on them, then you can probably start gathering the data so that you'll have ample time for the analysis of it. Because like what we've learned in practical research, qualitative researches take time, especially when it comes to interpreting that bulk of information that you will have gotten after the gathering of the data. So we now go to this concept of freedom of the human person. On the question of, are we really free? What's your how do you enjoy your freedom? Or is there really such a thing as total freedom? Is there such a concept of authentic freedom? How free is freedom? Because for so many times now, from a realistic perspective, no matter how true your claim is that you have some freedom to enjoy, the fact remains that for as long as you live, yes, for as long as you live, your freedom ends when another person's freedom begins. Let's face that. Even if Alona would say, I have the freedom to slap you in the face. And then, assuming that Alona would say that to Allen, I am free to do this to you. Then Allen can exercise his freedom to say, I have the freedom to enjoy not being slapped in the face. So see, there is now a conflict of two people's freedoms. Of course, this conflict comes out if freedom is understood in its literal connotation. If we understand freedom in its essence, then we'll get to, of course, experience or enjoy the freedom that is attributed to each of us. On this end, allow me to do a quick share screen of the discussion for this morning. On the discussion of freedom of the human person. So you have this. What is freedom? Or what is basically the essence of freedom? Freedom is seen as an intrinsic and essential property of the person, meaning it's part of who we are and it's a basic component that each of us possesses. The human person, by nature, is a free being. And since we are free beings, naturally we are, it is also imperative on our end to continue looking for freedom. Our inherent freedom makes us very dynamic, and our actions do not necessarily follow a set pattern or a predetermined course. Since freedom is something that we can explore, it would then follow that our actions are not necessarily placed on a pattern, that we are free to do something new each day, and that we should, of course, be reminded that in doing so, others are also enjoying the capacity to do what they also want. If we claim that we are not bound to a pattern, that our actions are not bound to a pattern, we should be reminded, that if we should be If our individual selves claim that the I does not do not follow a pattern for one's actions, others are doing actually the same. That when they do something, it's not out of a pattern. Freedom is the power to be what you want to be and the ability to decide and create yourself. Since no predetermined course is being observed in the concept of freedom, the person has the power then to create oneself in whatever way he or she wishes to be. It even gives the ability to strive for the improvement of one's talents by dedicating time and effort. Freedom gives the person the chance to maximize the talent that he or she possesses. But of course, maximizing it requires time and effort. And no one can stop you from doing so. Another thing, another essence of freedom is that it is rooted in the human person's self-determination and the exercise of, sorry, this is the exercise of intellect and free will. To know that freedom comes from our self-determination is that humans should be aware that consequences come in the exercise of freedom. Correct. Once freedom is exercised, it's not to be exercised blindly. When someone chooses to say something rude to some other person, a consequence is expected to also come. That is why, in the context of of putting freedom in the roots of self-determination, we are reminded that we should use our intellect and free will in the exercise of freedom. As said, a person's every action is freely determined, and this action defines him or her. It shows or determines the kind of person he or she becomes, because that's a consequence. That's the consequence that follows once you choose to do something. In as much as it's a simple action, it's probably, who knows, it's probably a good determinant to help define who you are as a person. Freedom enables you to come up with new choices, as it does not confine our actions to those set or expected by others. The community where we belong tries to set expectations for ourselves. As students, I don't know if you've experienced this, but perhaps to a few, people in your household have already tried to set expectations for you. Like they want to see you do this, meet these achievements. They want to see you perform in particular manners. But it does not necessarily follow that their expectations for you are the ones that should define your actions. As you are supposed to enjoy your freedom, what others set for you do not necessarily mean the actions that you should also do. Even if they say you should take up this course when you proceed to college, your exercise of freedom gives you the chance to say, no, I'll take on a different course because I have the freedom to do it. However, there are just conventional practices by which the person cannot enjoy this. Diba? Let's face it, on a practical sense, there are families out there who would do something else. The worst would be, let's put it on a practical perspective, realistic perspective. Students taking a course in college. A student wishes to take up medicine, a pre-med course. To exercise freedom, that student would say, since I am free, I have the freedom to choose my course, I'll take this pre-med degree. But because the family probably is not that affluent to support the taking of the course, their expectations will overrule your freedom. The family will probably even tell the student, as of this time, we can't let you take it. So take this. This is what we expect you to take instead. So others' expectations have overruled your choice. When supposedly your freedom should have given you the chance to take a course of your choice. But then again, it's a case to case basis. Freedom also requires a degree of control from the person who exercises it. It's a freedom is not to be absolutely exercised. There needs to be some control. The true essence of freedom reminds us that there needs to be some form of control that we need to do, or else we would have encroached on another person's freedom. And once that happens, a conflict arises. And we know what conflicts bring. Kinds of freedom. We begin with physical freedom. Physical freedom exists when there is an absence of any physical restraint. A physical restraint is one that prevents you in terms of mobility. If it prevents you of where you want to go or where you want to be, that's a physical restraint. The absence of that is what we call as physical freedom. The person then has the freedom of mobility to go where he or she wants to go. Granted that the person has natural limitations, physical freedom allows him or her to act and move in a determined manner. You cannot, though, be everywhere at once. But your freedom, this kind of freedom, allows you to move from one place to another and to go wherever you want to go. Another kind of freedom is psychological freedom, the freedom of choice. If the freedom to be where you, if the freedom of not having physical restraints is physical freedom, psychological freedom is the freedom of choice, where you are free to perform actions that you consider right and wise. This is where a person is also free to act or not to act. That perhaps not doing anything is right and wise at that moment. Or if you choose to do something in response to a situation, then it might really be wise and right to do something at that point. If you do not do anything at that point as well, then you are exercising your psychological freedom. This is not to be abused though. Like for instance, sir, does this work for us when we make our assignments? Like, can I say, like, if my parents tell me, why are you not making your assignments? Why are you not doing household chores as of the moment? Hopefully, no one from you would say, "Ma, pa, I'm exercising my psychological freedom." Please do not do that. My, the subject will be dragged again. What freedom are you talking about? Ma, pa, this is my freedom of choice. Freedom of choice is to arrive at an action that is right and wise. Just because you did not act on something does not mean that you have fully embraced psychological freedom. Ask yourself, is it wise for me not to act on it? Was it right for me not to do something about it? Because if the answer is no, then you have wrongly practiced psychological freedom. Psychological freedom is innate and cannot be denied to a person. No outside force or influence can compel a person to take action against his or her will, since this relies on one's capacity to choose. To choose, of course, something right or wise. You are not to be influenced or forced by anybody. So then again, please do not use this as an alibi at home. Mapa, can you please not tell me? Can you not force your ideas on me? Can you not force me to do these works? Can you not force me to clean my to fix my bed? I have my freedom of choice. That's an incorrect application of psychological freedom. Next, you have moral freedom. Moral freedom is using freedom in a manner that upholds human dignity and goodness. If it is geared towards the upholding, the valuing of dignity and life, respecting life and goodness, then you have there an exercise of moral freedom. This believes that freedom is not an object a person may use in whatever way he or she pleases. If it is to uphold human dignity and goodness, then freedom is not to be abused or nor misused. A person must use his or her freedom well, and then that person becomes less free when he or she uses it in a bad way. Just look at what happens to those who are to those who are considered inmates or convicts. As they exercise their freedom immorally, they've been imprisoned. Putting them in prisons restricts their freedom, lessens their freedom, because their action has degraded human dignity. Instead of upholding human dignity has been abused. In effect, the freedom of the person doing the wrong act has become lessened. Humans have a natural inclination for what is true and good. And when a person uses his or her freedom to do acts that violate human dignity and goodness, he or she dehumanizes himself or herself and effectively negates human freedom. So this is what I've just said. In an attempt to violate human dignity and goodness, that practice of human freedom is already negated. Therefore, the person guilty of the act will have decreased his or her chances of enjoying human freedom. Negative freedom. Negative freedom is a kind of freedom from any form of coercion or interference. This refers merely to the absence of an interference, and by interference, we mean something that is intentionally imposed on a person, intentionally restricted, intentionally told for one not to do. In the absence of these things, you have a negative freedom to enjoy. It may come in the form of a physical coercion, such as kidnapping or imprisonment, or a verbal coercion, such as issuing of threats to another person. One in negative freedom, in the context of negative freedom, one is considered free when he or she does not experience any of these forms of coercion or interferences. If you have negative freedom, there's also what we can call as positive freedom, which is considered as true freedom, as it is not just the absence of coercion or interference. It is a kind of freedom that requires active effort on the person who is to be free. He or she who is free is the one who has the control or mastery of him or herself. More than just being let alone by others, the person here is deemed to be free because he is able to steer so that all may follow a single direction. Positive freedom provides the person a full control of where he or she brings his own life, directs his or her own life. But take note, let's always be reminded that in the exercise of these freedoms, we need to also consider first voluntariness, which is the ability of a person to act out of his or her own free will and self-determination, to decide or not to act even if he or she is not required or called to take action. That's voluntariness and responsibility. Whatever kind of freedom you're trying to exercise, be reminded that you should define that freedom in terms of voluntariness and responsibility. Voluntariness was discussed already earlier, that you are doing it and no one told you, forced you to do it, and that you should be accountable for your actions and their consequences. You should not exercise freedom and be blind of what comes after. Be accountable, be ready for whatever consequence that may come. Responsibility can also have a positive or negative meaning, as it goes hand in hand with voluntariness in determining the morality of an action. One needs to be prepared in case something not good comes out in the exercise of freedom. For instance, yeah, this reminds me, when your performance task, let's apply this in your case as students. When your performance tasks were given last week, of course, you get to enjoy that freedom of doing it right away or not. The performance tasks were given. We did not provide any form of coercion. We did not provide any form of hindrance for you to accomplish the performance tasks. The decision on when you'd like to work on them, the decision on how well you'll work these performance tasks, the decision on when you'd like to submit them was at your disposal, though there are subjects who place some deadlines. However, I noticed that there are a few from your class who did not submit a performance task yet. Yes, the truth is, as of this day, there are still a few from your class who did not yet submit a performance task. Whoever these students are, they will have to work on the consequence, be accountable of the consequence of their choice to not submit a performance task yet. That's part of responsibility, and it's their voluntariness that made them decide not to submit anything yet. Did I tell them not to submit? No. Of course, why will I say that? Why will I tell them not to submit anything? They have voluntarily not submitted anything yet. And out of that voluntariness, they should be ready to face the consequence or the consequences for not submitting a performance task up until now. This reminds you, of course, that when you exercise your freedom, it should be responsible and beneficial. You should set limits to your freedom and learn to moderate or control one's thoughts, emotions, actions, depending on the situation. A person can even choose to limit his or her own freedom or even surrender it entirely if it results in greater benefits. Freedom should be exercised with regard for knowledge and truth. And the ability to acquire information and truthful knowledge aids us in making wise and informed choices. Remember earlier that there's one type of freedom that requires for you to exercise it in a right and wise manner. Your knowledge, your stock knowledge, or your knowledge of the many things around you, your acceptance of these worldly truths will guide you to arrive at such wise exercise and informed exercise of freedom. As human persons, our nature drives us to uphold human dignity and goodness. This lesson on freedom is also closely tied to existentialism. This term came out in the introduction in the introductory part of this subject. Existentialism is a philosophy that emphasizes individual existence, freedom, and choice. It is the view that humans define their own meaning in life and try to make rational decisions despite existing in an irrational universe. It focuses on the question of human existence and the feeling that there's no purpose or explanation at the core of existence. It holds that the only way to counter this nothingness is by embracing existence. Existentialism, absolute existentialism, does not recognize any transcendent force or a being named God. As absolute existentialism believes that your pure existence is the one that defines why you are here. Existence is the very reason for your purpose. Existence is what defines anything that you do. Like, for instance, existentialism believes that when you do something good to others, it is not because you want to be saved or you want to have eternal salvation. No. Existentialism believes that doing good is done, or an act of goodness is shown because that's just part of who you are as you exist in this world. That you just do something good in order to live a good life. If you wish to have a good existence, if you wish to be remembered as a good person, then you are living a good life. You are living such life not because there is this hope that you go to heaven. No, existentialism, absolute existentialism doesn't work that way. Existentialism just simply reminds you that living a good life is for the sole reason that you want an acknowledgement that your existence in this world was also good. However, me introducing existentialism right now is not to invite you to reject the presence of God. My introduction of existentialism to you is just to introduce you to the concept of existence. In fact, one practical application of existentialism is when you ask yourselves, do I have a choice? Familiar with that? You might have probably reached that point in your life when you said, do we have a choice? Doing the performance task. We don't have any choice but to do this. Actually, from an existentialist point of view, you always have a choice. Because your existence tells you whether you should do it or you don't. You exist either to do such performance tasks or you exist not to do such a performance task. From an existentialist point of view, there will always be a choice for everything. Even when it comes to breathing. An existentialist would tell you that you may not breathe. If your purpose is to stop breathing at that moment, then so be it. But of course, you should be ready with the consequence. Should you choose not to breathe, what's the consequence? You'll die. Should you choose to continue breathing, what's the consequence? You continue living. You live. From an existentialist point of view, no one is telling you to do something right away. Existentialism gives you the options. Of course, you remind yourself, why am I here? What should I do? What are my choices? What are my options? This is how we could practically apply existentialism. Personally, I would suggest you do not embrace the absolute concept of existentialism of ignoring a transcendent force. I don't know. But of course, if one of you here leans on absolute existentialism, I hope I'm not to be blamed. If one of you realizes later on, I think I'm an absolute existentialist, meaning you don't recognize God, you believe that your existence is of your full control and mastery, then yet that your exercise of choice is just up to you, and that you could care less of what happens to your soul afterwards, because you're existing for the sole reason of being remembered as a good person. That's your call. If you choose to ignore that divine being that has been introduced in our religion classes, in our morality classes, that's your call. If you embrace absolute universal existentialism, again, that's your choice. But I would suggest that you apply existentialism practically. That when you meet a lot of crossroads, when you continue living, you'll still continue. You'll really be meeting a lot of crossroads. You practice that existentialist perspective. You ask yourself, what should I do now? The moment that question is posed, it brings about a lot of options. Next week for your major exam, how long will I invest to study this subject? How many hours will I spend to study this subject? Will I study or not? What will I study first? These questions are existential questions because they lead to choices. And then you are to exercise your freedom to choose among these options. But just like what has been previously presented in the slides, be ready with the consequence. You should be responsible for whatever consequence that may come. You are going to voluntarily exercise that freedom, but you should be made aware that in exercising it, consequences follow. Questions? Questions? Do you have some questions? If there's none, that actually concludes the discussion of freedom of the human person. Do you have some questions? If there's none, I think we can answer. Okay, thank you. If there's none, I'll now end the recording. I'll now end the recording.